Okay, welcome to part 2 of Lecture 3. This is where we left off, talking about utilitarianism. So, utilitarianism is an ethical system that was formulated by originally Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, and his son John Stuart Mill. It's a form of hedonism, which says the ultimate good is pleasure, and we want and ought to want pleasure. So you may have heard the term hedonism before. Like, hedonism is a term that people associate with like lust and gluttony. Um, you might have been like, that person's a hedonist if they're the type of person, that, to tie it back to things we discussed earlier in this chapter, are kind of ruled by like first order desires like food and sex. But utilitarianism isn't necessarily like a form of what we will later refer to as like brute hedonism, but incorporates the sort of pleasures that come out of fulfilling second order desires or second order volitions as well. And it's not egotistical, it's not just concerned with the self, it's also concerned with the pleasure of others. And Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill were both actually vegetarians, even though they lived in the 18th century, because they were concerned about the pain and suffering of non human animals. So, to sum up, what utilitarianism is about is it's an ethical system that is concerned with acting and developing character that's oriented towards creating the greatest good for the greatest number. And the greatest number can be all life that's able to feel pain and pleasure, including non human animal life. So, to dig a little bit deeper, we'll start with Jeremy Bentham. So, he was born in the mid 18th century and lived on to the 19th century. And he articulated what's called the principle of utility, that one should act to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people and to avoid pain and suffering. And what he bases this whole system on is nature, and just the way that we seem, and other animals seem to be naturally wired to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. So, to the extent that that is what we're sort of wired to be about, that should inform, how we approach ethics and morality. And so, to determine the right course of action in a situation, one should act in order to produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people and to avoid pain and suffering. And to do that, like, when you're making that determination, you need to involve what Bentham referred to as the happiness calculus. So these are like sort of quantitative things to consider when you're thinking about, how do I produce the greatest good? And a good, again, means pleasure and the avoidance of pain. So things to consider would be the intensity of pain or pleasure, duration, certainty or uncertainty that a given action will result in pain or pleasure, propinquity, which is like the proximity or nearness of pleasure, or remoteness. So propinquity is like it being near you, how close to you is the pain and pleasure, or how remote. Some limitations of Jeremy Bentham is that, not everyone seems to be wired in such a way where pain and pleasure is super clear cut. And there are sadistic people who derive pleasure from causing other people pain. The other major limitation with utilitarianism as a whole is that you can use people and non-human animals as means to an end. I should say an end, not and end. So, for example, during the Holocaust, this is like a classic example, the Nazis did terrible human experiments on people, mostly Jews, that were in concentration camps, like horrible medical experiments. However, those medical experiments gave us a lot of knowledge about human beings. For example, how human beings respond to cold and heat. And that gave us a lot of medical knowledge that's been immensely valuable since then. So this is really dark, but a utilitarian could be like, okay, how many people were like suffered in these experiments? And I don't know, like a couple hundred, a couple thousand. How many lives over the next several centuries are going to be improved in terms of pain and pleasure because of the sacrifices of those people that were experimented on involuntarily. So that's really nasty, but there is no element to the principle of utility that says that you can't cause a little bit of pain or even a lot of pain in order to prevent an even greater amount of pain. So that's sort of a limitation of the principle of utility. But Jeremy Bentham, and as I mentioned, John Stuart Mill, who we'll talk about in a minute, were very compassionate people, extraordinarily compassionate, and which was almost completely unheard of for their time, also, vegetarian and didn't eat animal flesh because they were concerned with the welfare of animals. So John Stuart Mill builds on Jeremy Bentham and sort of refines utilitarianism a little bit. And what his major contribution was where Jeremy Bentham is more quantitative about pain and pleasure. John Stuart Mill says it's not just the quantity of pleasure that counts, but also the quality. So, a really important quote that comes from him is that it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So, he's trying to move utilitarianism away from sort of this brute hedonism of pleasure being like physical pleasures or fulfilling first order desires. So he's saying like the more you refine your tastes and the more you self-actualize as a person, the more you experience what he would refer to as higher pleasures, such as, so for example, reading the entirety of The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky would be a greater pleasure than eating a cheeseburger, for example. And he also was sort of defending utilitarianism from this really reductive critique that it was just hedonism trying to be packaged in like a more sophisticated way by pointing out that an ancient Greek school of philosophers known as the Epicureans were technically hedonists. And Epicureans were basically concerned with what John Stuart Mill is talking about. They were into really sophisticated, elevated forms of pleasure and thought that those were what gives one meaning in life. So another little vocab word is someone that's a foodie. We use the term foodie. A synonym for foodie would be Epicurean. So if you're someone that likes fine dining or likes really sophisticated food, then you are an Epicurean. But Epicureans were ancient Greek school of philosophers that were associated with higher pleasures, but they were really famous for also being invested in really sophisticated culinary stuff. An issue to point out is that cultivating higher faculties and this sort of valorization of like higher, more quote unquote sophisticated pleasures kind of reinforces some ideas about classism, that people that are wealthy and have more time to engage in higher faculties are more likely to achieve these higher forms of satisfaction. You could read that first quote, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, through like sort of a classist lens and be like working people that work like really in wild hours that for fun just like to drink and smoke and have a good time in a more sort of less elevated way, that they're like a pig satisfied. So that'd be really classist and problematic way of reading this. And it's important to note that cultivating higher faculties corresponds to education, and not everybody has access to an education that can help make higher faculties and higher forms of pleasure accessible. Just as not everybody can be an Epicurean, not everybody can afford to, buy fancy food and go out to eat at fancy restaurants. But he reinforced the idea that pleasure or happiness is the only thing desirable as an end. It is an intrinsic good. It is inherently, in and of itself, good. And all other desirable things are desired for the pleasure that they produce. So, some questions from this chapter so far. What does it mean to say morality is objective or subjective? What is cultural relativism and what is ethical relativism? So, as it's been said before, some of these questions on the question slides in the lectures and on the PowerPoints are questions that you might see again on the exams and on your study guides for the exams. So, the way I'm going to answer them in the lecture is really cursory and limited. But if you saw these questions on a study guide or on an exam, you would need to explain in more detail and depth than I'm about to do right now. So, the gist of it is that to say morality is objective is to say it's discovered, it exists as an object independent of human or otherwise subjects, that it exists independently from minds perceiving morality, that it is out there, it's the tablet in the sky, so to speak. To say it is subjective means that morality is created by subjects or minds that are able to perceive and make moral determinations. It is dependent on subjects, and there is no independent tablet in the sky with morals written on it, so to speak. Cultural relativism is just the factual claim that differences exist in terms of morality across different cultures. It doesn't say that's a good thing. It doesn't say that's a bad thing. It is a factual acknowledgement that, hey, there are differences between moral values and moral systems and ethics across different cultures. Ethical relativism is a position that makes that observation and builds off it a bit and says, hey, those differences are actually substantial and pretty deep and not just superficial. And this is all related because some people that want to argue that morality is objective, an argument against the fact that there is moral laws and rules and a tablet in the sky and morality exists objectively independent from human opinions. An argument against that would build off of cultural relativism. And be like, well, then what do we do with the fact that there are all these differences? And so the objectivist might say, well, these differences are not substantial. And the ethical relativist would say, well, yes, they are. And moving from cultural relativism to ethical relativism can start building an argument against objective morality. So, what are some limitations of arguing that homosexuality is wrong because it is unnatural? So, you could describe the fallacy that Hume explained, the appeal to nature fallacy, where it is fallacious to derive an ought from an is. That to make any argument that something should or should not be on the basis of nature is deriving an ought from an is. But more specifically, some arguments that we looked at is that unusual does not always mean bad. It is unusual to have an IQ of 150, but we would not say that being a genius is bad. Non-human animals do exhibit homosexual behaviors, so if it exists independently in nature outside of human experience, that's another argument. And then this argument that it is wrong because it's unnatural is often tied to an argument of disgust, that homosexuality disgusts some people, and that's a poor argument for saying something is wrong as well. I don't like gore. I think pretty much almost every medical intervention under the sun is disgusting, but I don't think that any of those medical interventions are wrong because they're disgusting. I think observing or conducting an open heart surgery would be absolutely revolting to me. It's disgusting, but I don't think that open heart surgery is wrong. So, what is utilitarianism? What complexities did Mill add to Bentham's happiness calculus? So, you would want to articulate the principle of utility, that according to utilitarians, you must act in order to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. And that can include non-human animals. It can include all sentient life, or all life that's able to experience pain or pleasure. And Bentham's happiness calculus was concerned with quantitative ways of measuring pain and pleasure. So intensity, duration, proximity, remoteness, certainty or uncertainty. And Mill was like, that's important, but we also need to consider the quality of pleasure as well. So it is, you can do that quote from Socrates and the Pig here, in that this Mill, it clarifies that utilitarianism is not a brute hedonism, but accounts for sophisticated and more elevated pleasures, as well as having even more value than fulfilling first order desires. So on to Nietzsche. So Nietzsche is often considered a very subversive figure. A lot of people dislike Nietzsche because he was very openly racist and specifically anti-Semitic. So that's highly problematic. However, it was Nietzsche that provided a basis for existentialism, which we'll talk about in a moment, and pretty much like all of queer theory and feminist theory. So there are a lot of feminists and queer theorists and critical race theorists and theorists that are involved in social justice today that build off of Nietzsche, because he said basically that everything is constructed, everything is subjective, and those in power have power not because of innate reasons or anything, but because they just exerted the will to power. So Nietzsche is highly problematic, especially if you see the ways that he reflects ideas about race and ethnicity in his time. But Nietzsche, at some of his philosophy at the core, has been reclaimed in ways that are extremely essential to feminism and queer liberation and even critical race discourse, ironically. And it's sort of complex, and we don't have a lot of time to go into some of the specificities of that. But you'll hear a lot of people say that he was horrible, and not to be dismissive of that or downplay his racism or anti-Semitism, but you can't acknowledge that without acknowledging how he's foundational for what would be termed deconstructionism, which is a 20th century philosophy that is foundational to feminist theory and queer theory. So Nietzsche is very subversive. He sort of takes ideas and concepts that people think of as universal and objective and tries to subvert them and sort of deconstruct them. And the main way that he does that is through genealogy. He tells the story of how ideas that we think are fixed and natural change over time. And by doing that, can destabilize the idea that these concepts and these ideas are objective and real outside of human invention. So I'm going to give an example. So for I went to seminary, and when I went to seminary, a lot of my fellow students found it very disconcerting to learn that the concept of hell came not from Christianity, not from Judaism, but from an ancient Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. That Zoroaster was a prophet that lived 1500 to 1800 years before Jesus. So that's almost the amount of time between Zoroaster and Jesus as between us and Jesus. That's how ancient this religion is. And they came up with the concept of an immortal. They didn't come up with the concept, they either came up with it or discovered the concept of the immortal soul, heaven or hell, an apocalypse, the resurrection of the dead. All of those things come from Zoroastrianism. And their concept of hell, they believed, was temporary, that hell was a place for bad people to temporarily go to. But when their God, Ahura Mazda, triumphs at the apocalypse, hell is destroyed and all the beings in hell make it to heaven. And so learning about the history of the concept of hell and how, for example, people that, particularly Christians, that were in a context where they were being oppressed, were influenced by this concept and started believing hell was a permanent place. In reaction to their oppression, that understanding that history about the concept of hell can make someone less likely to believe that hell is a real place. When you know that history, it seems likely that, or you at least have the option to now believe that it's a concept that is created by human beings and has a history and changes over time in relation to human situations. So that is an example of how genealogy, or understanding the history of an idea, can subvert the idea, can be subversive. Now, this example, I haven't just disproven hell right now. It's entirely possible that Zoroastrians discovered the truth about hell and were wrong about its permanence, and Christians perfected the concept of hell with its permanence. Literalist Christians, not all Christians literally believe in hell, but that is possible. I haven't disproven that right now by giving you that history. But I think that's a good example of how knowing the history about ideas that people take very literally and think of as very real and objective can subvert those ideas. So why are we talking about Nietzsche? Because he does that with morality. In the genealogy of morals and Beyond Good and Evil, two of Nietzsche's works, he looks at the history of the development of morality and in a very thorough and, quite frankly, convincing way. If you read the text, talks about how for the ancients, morality was thought of in terms of good and bad. And the good was associated with the nobility, and the bad was everything that was common or associated with the peasants and slaves and common people. And that there was a slave revolt in morality. And with the slave revolt in morality, there became a switch or a transition into, instead of distinguishing between good and bad, being the noble versus the common, you develop good and evil, which is a complete reversal, where the good is everything common and humble and meek, and evil is everything egotistical and self-serving and overly selfish and overly indulgent. It's a complete reversal. And and a lot of his anti-Semitism goes from, he thinks this is a bad thing. He thinks that this is a replacement of what he calls master morality with slave morality, and that this good and evil slave morality is a triumph of the herd instinct in humanity. And his anti-Semitism comes because he believes that Jewish people and Jewish culture paved the way for slave morality, which really becomes crystallized in Christianity. And we can see that in Christian morality, good is meek, humble, the meek shall inherit the earth, or whatever it is, and Jesus was humble and he's with the poor and the common, and evil would be like, it is harder in the Bible it says it is harder, it is easier to pass through the head of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Okay, so it's a complete reversal. And so he thinks this is sort of a bad thing because it stifles genius and creativity and uniqueness and innovation, and he calls the new morality slave morality. The Ubermensch is his idea of someone that's able to triumph over this system and develop a unique set of morality that's independent of master and slave morality. And he doesn't give a lot of content about what that would actually look like. And some of his genealogy is looking at the etymology or the literal meaning of roots of words. So, for example, the word Cretan was a word that meant like bad, or cretinous means like lowly and gross and bad, and that Cretan is etymologically linked to the word Christian. So it was a time when master morality was observing the revolution of slave morality, that Christianity was really crystallizing, and it was like a backlash against that. So the word Cretan was used, as an insult, but that eventually it triumphed. A lot of people point out how we're living in an interesting moment, because under capitalism, capitalist moral values are more like master morality, and Christian moral values are more like slave morality, according to Nietzsche, of course. So a lot of scholars write about the cognitive dissonance of Christian capitalists, where they embrace a religion of humility and meekness, but believe in an economic system of basically, like, you could argue greed or accumulation and selfishness, and just sort of the cognitive dissonance that goes along with that. So Jean-Paul Sartre was influenced by Nietzsche. This is centuries later. This is the 20th century. And he was a major figure of what's called existentialism. So in terms of ethics, he believed in radical relativism as opposed to traditional moralizing. So he said what we're basically doing is, he was a subjectivist, and he's like, if you take subjectivism seriously, that morality is subjective, then think of the radical creativity that you possess as a human being, that you are defining mankind. And he uses the word mankind, but it's preferable to use the word humankind. It's an extra syllable and is less androcentric, which we'll talk about androcentrism later in this lecture. That when you act, you are basically saying, this is what I choose mankind to be, that you are defining. There is no given human nature. You are creating human nature. That individuals and groups of individuals create human nature, not that human nature determines individuals and groups of individuals. So the gist of existentialism, the philosophical movement that Jean-Paul Sartre is a seminal figure in, is that existence precedes essence. So in terms of morality, that's exactly what I'm saying. There is no human nature. There's no essence. There's no essential human nature. There's no essential anything in existence. That the concrete bodies that exist precede essence. Essence is what we can extract from observing the messy bodies of people and things that actually exist. It's not that people and things that actually exist participate in these pure, original, clean essences. That these essences, if they have any existence, are created by the concrete actions of human bodies and subjects in space and time. So he believes in subjectivism, which emphasizes the freedom of the individual subject, and that humans cannot pass beyond human subjectivity. So it's a little complicated, basically, because he's not. So we talked about like freedom and determinism earlier in this chapter. Jean-Paul Sartre isn't actually concerned very much with how true it is that we metaphysically truly have free will. What he's concerned about is that regardless of whether we are free and have free will, we experience ourselves as having free will to an extent. And working from that, and working from the responsibility that comes from that. Simone de Beauvoir was a partner of Jean-Paul Sartre. She was a woman, and she was a major figure in feminist theory. She was a second wave French feminist. And she was a profound philosopher as well. She was sort of eclipsed by Jean-Paul Sartre, but in a lot of people's opinion, she was actually a better philosopher than Jean-Paul Sartre, even though she was less of a like sort of rock star figure. But they were very much like rock star philosophers in the 1950s and 60s in France. And she says one is not a being but a becoming, which is again this existential existentialist idea that existence precedes essence. So it's not like, according to Simone de Beauvoir, it's not like, hey, you guys are in college, you're going to find out who you really are. There is no real you to find out. There is no true you. You are creating yourself. Have the radical freedom to be whoever you want. And you are not discovering yourself, you are creating yourself. She emphasizes ambiguity in ethics and that there needs to be an embracing of ambiguity or unclearness, that some questions can't be answered and that's okay, and actually learning to celebrate that. And she also emphasizes that freedom be associated as a pleasure, but it can actually be agonizing. It is a burden to have free will or experience yourself as having free will. It is a burden to have to create yourself from scratch, that there isn't some magic you to discover, according to her thought. Ethics and gender. So Carol Gilligan was an ethicist who was a feminist ethicist who came up with feminist care ethics. She did this because she exposed what she found was male bias in ethics. For example, she said a lot of she was the 20th century as well. She said a lot of ethics comes from the vantage point of thinking about goodness is selflessness and being more selfless, and being bad is being selfish. And she says that's true for a lot of men's experience, but a lot of women, it's the opposite, that they're overly concerned with those around them and that their sin or their flaw is not caring enough for themselves. She also had a critique where she said a lot of ethics has been determined and written about by men, and that another sort of masculinist bias in ethics is focusing on abstract rules and laws and then applying them in context and valuing those principles and laws over the actual nitty-gritty embodied context that actions are taking place. She also pointed out that there's a gendered binary of reason and emotion that doesn't really make sense. We need to ungender this binary, and we need to think outside of the binary and think of all the ways that reason and emotion overlap, kind of like Rousseau did earlier in this lecture. So she said masculinist ethics is focused on abstraction. Let's come up with rules that we apply in context. Where she says most women are socialized to reason ethically in terms of the context. That it's don't give me a rule to apply in situations. Let's start with the details of the situations, the specifics of the relationships of the people that are involved in the moral dilemma. That is of primary importance in ethical reasoning, and that way of looking about moral reasoning is distinctly feminine. She didn't have a lot to say about whether she thought these gender differences in ethical reasoning were more because of biological differences between men and women or because of differences in how men and women are socialized. But it's sort of, her points are interesting either way. She pointed out that, and Simone de Beauvoir pointed this out too, that humanness is associated with maleness versus femaleness is associated with nature or everything that is non-human nature. So for example, the word maternal, the root of the word maternal is mother. So, like your maternal grandmother is your mother's mother, maternal. The root of the word maternal, M-A-T-E-R, is the Latin word mother. It is the same root that is in material and matter. That physicality, bodies, embodiment, physical nature, the planet, earth, matter, all of that is considered feminine. And transcendence, God, the soul, the intellect, that which is not embodied, is considered male. And there's a overvaluing of those things as more human. and things associated female and embodied as more non-human animal and animalistic. And just a vocab word is conflating humanness and maleness as androcentrism. And the best examples of androcentrism are in language. How we use the word man and mankind to refer to both men and women. And it's confusing because sometimes, like, for example, all men are created equal. When the founding fathers said that, by men, they meant white, land-owning men. They sometimes men in philosophy and in the history of Western thought, when the word men or man is used, they really just mean men. But today we kind of read into it that, oh, women are included as well, but that's not always the case. So some questions. We're almost done. So explain what Nietzsche means by master morality and slave morality. What do these two ethical perspectives suggest about the nature of morality? So you'd want to connect what he means by good versus bad with master morality and sort of define what good and badness would mean more concretely under master morality, and how good and evil correspond to slave morality. And from the perspective of what he calls slave morality, what would good and evil, what would that mean? What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be evil? And these two ethical principles suggest that the nature of morality might not be objective, is basically what he's saying. He's subverting objective morality by trying to demonstrate how values and morality have changed over time and are therefore a human creation, a human invention, and are subjective. How might traditional ethical theories and ways of moral reasoning involve a male bias? And explain the approach of Carol Gilligan's feminist care ethics. So some ways that male bias is involved, according to Carol Gilligan, is associating goodness with self-sacrifice and the bad with selfishness, when that is not normally the moral struggles of a lot of women. Another male bias is focusing on abstraction over context. And you would need to, if you saw this question on a study guide or exam, explain more than I'm explaining right now. Explain the approach of Carol Gilligan's feminist care ethics. So what she wanted, and we didn't talk about this much, so I'll talk about it here. What she meant was to sort of reverse that and think of moral reasoning as beginning in context, that it matters. So a moral dilemma, the most relevant information maybe in a moral dilemma is the particular specific relationships of the individuals involved in the dilemma. So that would be like sort of how she approaches that. And also embracing a feminist sort of ethic of being self-sacrificing as well, but also realizing that a lot of the needs of women involve not being more self-sacrificing, but, I think the buzzword today would be like engaging in more self-care would be like the buzzword that a lot of people might want to use today. Okay, and that is it for lecture 3.